This episode is brought to you by New Focus Recordings. New Focus is an independent creative music label based in New York City, dedicated to providing a space for artists who are primarily active in the contemporary concert music community to release their carefully curated recordings.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Austin, composer of such works as Clavier Double and Homage for Hildegard. On the second episode of The Ladies Speak, we examine the life and music of Gena Branscombe. Born in Canada in 1881, she moved as a teenager to the United States, where she lived the rest of her life and composed most of her work. Branscombe remained loyal to her birth country, but also quickly developed a deep connection to her adopted homeland. Patriotism, along with love, is a theme interwoven throughout her work, evinced by the brass instrumentation that she frequently employed, as well as the stories of military triumphs and losses that she often turned to as the underlying stories for her compositions. Branscombe also found inspiration in historical events on both sides of the 49th parallel, including her most celebrated work, Pilgrims of Destiny, completed in 1920. But that dramatic oratorio was also born out of a devastating personal tragedy that led her to view the journey of the Mayflower as a story of how the human spirit can be tested by and rise above hardship. Thank you for listening.
I'm Kathleen Shimeta. I am retired from singing, but in my performing days, I was a mezzo-soprano. I did do some opera with the North Carolina Opera and Charlotte Opera. About 20 years ago, I was hired to give an art song recital in Florida. They asked me to do particularly a Valentine's Day recital. Then it came to me, the greatest love poem there is How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways. Why not find a woman composer who would have set that? I went to two different books about women composers. In both books, the name of Gena Branscombe was there. In her life, she had set 6 of the sonnets of the Portuguese by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. I took them to my pianist, collaborator, and friend, Martin Hannessy. We read through them. When we finished, he stood up from the piano, he looked at me, and he said, "Who is this woman? She writes just beautiful songs. You must record these." Martin agreed to record 4 of her piano works, and that began my journey. During this process of putting together the CD, I happened to attend an off-Broadway show called Sunflower. It was about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. As I sat there watching this one-woman show, it came to me, that's what I need to do. I need to tell Gena Branscombe's story. Gena Branscombe was born in Picton, Ontario in November of 1881. As a young girl, she woke up in the middle of the night hearing sounds, unearthly sounds. She couldn't get over it. Well, come to find out, there was a military regiment who had marched through town playing music. In Picton were 3 churches. Each church had its own concert series. Her parents would take Gena to these concerts. Gena would become overwhelmed with emotion and cry when she left the concerts. Her parents became quite concerned that she got so emotional that they almost threatened not to take her anymore.
My name is Roger Branscombe Pheonix. My mother was the oldest daughter of Gena Branscombe. Since she was a very small child, she felt that she was hearing music that was coming from somewhere else, coming from another world or another, whatever you call it. She didn't call it heaven or God or anything, but she called it music that she all of a sudden got, and it wasn't something she made up, it was something she heard that existed.
She began piano lessons at a young age. I think it was 4 or 5. She began piano lessons with a local organist in Picton. What was missing in her training at that point and until she left for college was a background in theory, a background in history, because she had a natural talent for improvising, for hearing something, being able to replay it on the keyboard. She was a natural-born talent. At the late 1800s, when Gena was about 15, 1896, her family, meaning her mother and father, were trying to figure out where Gena should go to school. They chose Chicago. Chicago was a center for great music. In Chicago was the Chicago Musical College. It was an outstanding musical college. Her mother accompanied her and stayed with her for her first year in Chicago. They boarded at a Mrs. Berry's house, boarding house. Mrs. Berry's house had a piano in the attic where Gena could practice. Mrs. Berry heard Gena's talent, spoke to her minister, Dr. Gonzalez, who knew Dr. Florence Ziegfeld, who ran the Chicago Musical College. Dr. Gonzalez arranged for an audition for Gena. Dr. Ziegfeld immediately accepted her at the Chicago Music College. Her first piece of music was published by Hatch Music out of Philadelphia in 1899. It was a great accomplishment to have a woman's music published. These men that published her saw something in her music that they felt, number one, would sell. Second of all, that they took the chance of putting her name as Gena Branscombe, that it was definitely a woman. These men were ahead of their time. Gena spent 11 years in Chicago, underpaid, because in the list of payments for salaries for teachers at Chicago Musical College, women were on the lower half of making money. In 1903, she accepted a position as head of the piano department at the Whitman Conservatory of Music in Walla Walla, Washington. She taught theory, she taught composition, she taught piano, she composed. Faculty members gave concerts of her music. Her world expanded at that point. While Gena was in Walla Walla, Washington, she had a fine violinist on the faculty, her fellow faculty member, Roy Williams. She wrote several sketches and other pieces for him to perform in recital. In 1908, the president of Whitman had a Christmas party to which Gena was invited. At that party was a man by the name of John Ferguson Tenney. He was quite smitten with her. He pursued her actively through 1908. She finally gave in and agreed to marry him. She informed John that if they were to get married, he was going to have to wait a year because she had already made plans to spend a year in Berlin, Germany, where she would study with Rudolf Ganz, who had moved back to Germany, and she was going to be introduced to Engelbert Humperdinck, the real Engelbert Humperdinck who wrote the opera Hansel und Gretel, not the Engelbert Humperdinck that said, "Please release me." During Gena's year in Berlin, she was notified that she and her best friend, soprano Belle Forbes, had been invited that evening to perform for President and Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt at a dinner party. Mrs. Roosevelt asked Belle if she would sing something American, maybe even something of Gena's. To great disappointment to Gena, Belle said she hadn't brought any of Gena's music with her. During 1909-1910, while Gena was in Germany, she not only was having her music performed there, she had a concert done at the American Women's Club there in Berlin, all of her own music, but she was also featured on a concert in New York City. She also was featured in Musical America, the magazine, as being an outstanding woman composer to be watched for. When Gena returned from Berlin, which was in the summer of 1910, arrangements were being made for her wedding to John Ferguson Tenney. After they were married, they moved to Douglaston, Queens, which is part of New York City. Later, they made their home on West 82nd Street, which is directly across the street from Central Park. Eventually, he became an underwriter for the New York Insurance Company, and that's how he supported his family. I think their marriage was a marriage of equality. He respected what she did.
And he was a very, very calm and quiet and a positive, very positive person.
He understood that for Gena to have a career, she needed time to compose, she needed time to write letters, she needed time to meet with colleagues and singers of that era to promote her own career. He made dinner, he changed diapers, he took the girls to church, he took them to Central Park to play. During that time, in 1910, the first year they were married, Arthur P. Schmidt came down from Boston and offered her an exclusive 7-year contract to publish her songs and any other pieces. Gena Branscombe composed mainly art songs through the teens and into the early 20s, even into 1930. Arthur Schmidt would ask her to do arrangements, choral arrangements, or he would give her a poem and say, or a German poem and say, please translate this and write a choral piece for it. She would talk about the difficulty of setting a particular word. When I went to the dictionary, I found that there might have been 5 or 6 different definitions of the song. She always chose the 5th or 6th one, the one that had deeper meaning to it. Her songs have a great deal to do with love. The love of being a daughter, the love for her parents, the love for her husband. She set things about heroes. She set songs about war. She wrote about historical figures. She composed 150 art songs. She composed piano works. She composed chamber music, as well as choral works, and some orchestral works as well. Part of her frustration in her letters was the fact that she never wrote a piano concerto. She never wrote a major piano sonata. She would say, I have an idea for this. I'm going to work on it this summer. 3 months later, she would say, I never got to it. Maybe because she had sick children, or maybe her nerves, maybe emotionally she couldn't come to do it. We don't really know. But that was one of her major regrets in her life, that she never put that out. We recorded my CD, I'll Love I Shall Find Thee, the songs of Gena Branscombe, over about 4 or 5 different sessions. 4 days after the events of 9/11 in New York City, we didn't get everything I wanted recorded, but nearly everything. We ran out of time, but my sound engineer called up from the booth and he said, I tell you what, I'll give you an extra 15 to 30 minutes to record something else. I thought, well, what's the shortest song I have? How about Dear Lad of Mine? And I hear David, my sound engineer, flip through his music from the booth, and he gasped. The opening line is, War gods have descended. War gods have descended. The world burns up in fine, which means in darkness and ominous and horror. Well, I turned to Martin, I said, let's go for it. It was close to what we had experienced in New York just 4 days earlier. We got the song in one take. The emotions rose so high from our experience 4 days earlier, and that Dear Lad, Take Care of Yourself was, for me, all of us in New York and across our country and the world taking care of each other and sleeping well despite what had happened.
My mother told me she was born November 22nd, 1911, in New York City. She's talked about her youngest sister at the time, Betty, who was an adorable child, she said, the apple of her mother's eye. During that period, World War I occurred, and with the World War I came also the influenza epidemic. And in my mother's family, everybody was sick. And they couldn't find help because so many people in New York were sick that nurses and doctors weren't available.
In January of 1919, the entire Tenney family was sick. Betty got very ill. They brought in oxygen tanks. They had a nurse. No matter what they did, meaning the doctors and the family, there was nothing they could do to bring down Betty's fever or to open her lungs.
My mother remembered as Betty's every day, her fever got higher and she became less and less able to be even conscious of where she was in the room. She was really being ministered to by the doctors who felt that it was a downward spiral that she was in. And my mother remembered her father, John, standing by the window, very ill himself, hardly able to stand, and crying, which she had probably never seen.
And she died at the end of January 1919.
My mother said that Gena was in a lot of grief, and that she went into an intense period of work wearing black hats and black veils.
There didn't seem to be anything that could help her come out of that mourning period. John Ferguson Tenney, he knew that it was music that would bring Gena out of the depths of mourning. He begged Gena, please go back to composing. You must go back. And she did. Beginning that June, they spent the summer outside of New York City. Her husband did research for her. He babysat along with his mother-in-law. He cooked meals, and Gena began composing Pilgrims of Destiny. Gena Branscombe had a deep faith in God. I also think that especially when she lost Betty, she lost during that time a belief in God, that a loving God would take a child away. Yet when she wrote Pilgrims of Destiny, she wrote hope and belief in God that would see you through the worst of times. The dedication of Pilgrims of Destiny goes as follows. To all weaker and unknown ones who have kept the faith, dying joyously for the sake of a dream, and to my own little pilgrim Betty, I dedicate this work. Her little pilgrim Betty marched through the pandemic and being so horribly sick. She was now making a pilgrimage into peace. Pilgrims of Destiny begins with a storm swelling. The sailors boast of their life at sea. The pilgrims on the Mayflower are in despair. They are homesick, yet hopeful that their new country will appear on the horizon.
Will bring thee home.
A tender duet between brother and sister singing of their happy past, loneliness, and their deep love of each other. There are children's songs that are sung while they play games, remembered from their homeland. A mournful women's chorus questions the unknown future and why children and the shivering sick may not survive. Land is sighted, and the work ends with a chorus of thankful jubilation to God. The pilgrims are convinced that their new country shall be a temple filled with brotherhood, faith, and love. As the full orchestra accompanies the pilgrims, they know they will no longer suffer persecution for their beliefs. And it ends with trumpets. Gena Branscombe's music is based in the German school, the German Romantic. Her music with this beautiful melody also has very complex chord structures. It has deep harmonies, very rich harmonies. Gena Branscombe had a great deal of respect and honor and awe of Wagner. In Wagner's Ring Cycle, leitmotif is an identifier, as it were, for a character or for something that was going on. In Pilgrims of Destiny, Gena did the same thing. She used a leitmotif for water, for the storm, for traveling. You'll hear little indications of it in scenes, but you won't hear it extended and developed for long periods of time, but you know that that's what she's indicating. The deep emotion she gets from her harmonic language, you can see that in Humperdinck's violin pieces. One of the things that struck me as being really blatant on paper was their use of the triplet. Now, a triplet can be a slowing down of tempo. People think it really isn't, but it makes it sound as though you're taking a little time over that beat. They both used triplets a lot, but the triplets had meaning. In Pilgrims of Destiny, it was always, to me, as I saw it, plodding along, moving along to make a statement. Gena Branscombe began composing Pilgrims of Destiny in 1919 in the summer. By fall of 1920, it was nearly finished, nearly complete. Then it's a matter of orchestrating it, doing the corrections, the edits. She had certain sections of it performed for women's clubs. In 1927, in New York City, she had a performance of it at which the National Federation of Music Clubs board was there. The New York Times, a few days later, reviewed it and said it was a melodious and expressive piece of music. Then, in 1928, Gena submitted Pilgrims of Destiny to the National League of American Penwomen for their competition. It won, and she won $100. In 1929, the National Federation of Music Clubs had their convention in Plymouth, Massachusetts. It was performed there with local choruses and soloists, full orchestra. It got rave reviews saying that this was a great American composition. And following that performance, it was performed a few other places across the United States.
You have been listening to a radio presentation of the choral drama Pilgrims of Destiny.
Then in 1940, Gena had it performed on WNYC in New York City with chorus and soloists and orchestra. That was the last performance of the work. Many years later, I was invited to perform my one-woman show, Life, Love, Song, A Visit with Gena Branscombe in Hartford. And I met the director of that festival, Heather Seaton, who had a great interest in Gena's music. Probably 4 or 5 years ago now, Heather and I met at the Library of Congress. We called up the original conductor score from the stacks. We spent a day and a half scanning every page of that score. We couldn't believe what beautiful music it was. It became our mission to get it performed, but we had to make an orchestral score. When I returned from the Library of Congress, just a few days later, I received an email from Dan Ryan. I didn't know him, but he had purchased the piano vocal score at a garage sale. He told me in an email, I'm now the music director for choruses at Clark University in Worcester, and I want to perform this piece of music. I said, well, lucky you. I've just come back from the Library of Congress, and I have pictures of every page of that score. I also happen to have the pencil score as well. We worked together with his students from Clark University. We began putting the score note for note for note into Finale, the music program, and we recreated the orchestral score. We began entering Pilgrims of Destiny in August, and it was ready for the April 29th concert with the orchestral score still being corrected that night of the performance an hour beforehand. when you have that many people putting it in, somebody put in an E instead of an E flat, or something was missing, but we got the performance done. I was out of town, returning home from a performance of my one-woman show, Life, Love, Song. My husband said to me, "There's a very interesting message on our answering machine. The man's name is Pierre Bisquet." The next day, I called Pierre back. He said to me, "My mother and my 2 aunts were members of the Branscombe Choral. Gena Branscombe and her husband used to come to our house on occasion for dinner. On one of their visits for dinner to Pierre's family home, she brought 2 batons with her. She gave one to Pierre and one to his sister Peggy. And he said, 'Oh, and by the way, Kathleen, I still have that baton. Would you want it?' Of course, I blurted out immediately, 'Yes.' In late April 2019, Pilgrims of Destiny was introduced to the 21st century. The 2019 performance was the first performance of the work since 1940, 79 years. Dan had his Clark University chorus of nearly 100 singers. He had an orchestra. He had wonderful soloists. When the performance happened at Clark University, I told Dan Ryan, I said, "It would be wonderful if you conduct this first 21st century premiere of this piece with Gena's baton." What they decided was that Dan would announce from the podium right before the final scene, which was scene 6, that he was using Gena's baton to conduct that final movement. The audience gasped. It was really very touching. The family moves back into Manhattan in 1923. At around that time, the American Women's Association contacts her, and they invite her to be the conductor. This is a new fork in the road for her career. The American Women's Association decided to shut down. I presume financially or whatever their mission was came to an end. Many of the women from that chorus did not want to stop singing. They also wanted to continue working with Miss Branscombe. In 1934, they organized and drew up a charter to become the Branscombe Choral. For 20 years, that chorus existed. They performed out at the First United Nations out on Long Island. They sang Christmas carols to the commuters at Grand Central Station, at Pennsylvania Station. They performed on the radio. The General Federation of Women's Clubs had their Golden Jubilee Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1941. Gena was head of the music part of it. Gena created a program that would be done for the big concert at the convention. There were 1,000 women singing in this chorus. The reviews were great. She made sure that they performed music by women. I think in the 20 years that there were 18 or more women composers performed on the programs. Among the many compositions that were performed by the Branscombe Choral were works by Amy Beach, Harriet Ware, Mabel Daniels, but also Margaret Lang's Heavenly Know-Well. She felt America had a voice that needed to be heard. Her way of promoting that and promoting American women composers was her joining all these women's organizations, the National Federation of Music Clubs, the General Federation of Women's Clubs, the National League of American Pen Women. She organized concerts for the local level of those organizations. She would go out, play her own music. Mrs. Beach might be there playing as well. They would talk about American music. They would talk about American women composers. When Gena Branscombe gave speeches to these organizations to which she belonged, she would address a question of why there wasn't a female Bach, Beethoven, Brahms composer. She talked about how women had home lives that they had to take care of, that they didn't have the freedom that men did to just go into a studio and start writing for hours and hours and hours. She explained that women had to have the support of their husbands, their brothers, their fathers, who would give them an allotted amount of time to compose. I firmly believe she knew there were Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms of the female gender. They just didn't have the opportunities to be heard. John Ferguson Tenney died of cancer in 1949. It was a terrible time of grief for her. Again, she moved on with her life through her grief and continued with her Branscombe choral and her conducting and the composing she was doing.
Once John Tenney died, she felt very, 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 very alone. It was a time where the family sort of gathered around and tried to make sure that someone was always in touch with her.
In 1955, Gena joined her sister-in-law, Helen Bachtel, to make a trip to Hawaii. She flew to San Francisco, where she met up with Helen. They took an ocean liner to Hawaii. There were classes on board about culture in Hawaii, which both she and Helen attended. But what I loved the most, that at 70-some-odd years of age, she took hula lessons on shipboard. She gets to Hawaii, they make journeys among the islands, but while she's there, she hears the music, she hears bells ringing. This inspired her to write Pacific sketches that take the essence of Hawaii played by a French horn. Gena's final choral works were written as late as 1970. She died in 1977. Her funeral was at Riverside Church. All the music played was her own. Gena Branscombe fell into obscurity because during the end of her life, a lot of her music was destroyed by her publishers. The Pilgrims of Destiny scores were thrown into the furnace by Carl Fisher.
And Gena Branscombe had been devastated when it happened. She couldn't believe that they broke the plates and threw away all the sheet music when it still was being requested from various venues. And she absolutely, I think that was the thing that killed her more than anything else, was that here were these businesses that had supported her for so many years were now throwing away the music.
Women composers' music was destroyed far before men's music was. She put out a major violin sonata that never got published. The reason it never got published? Because publishers thought it was too difficult. They didn't think it was marketable to the everyday purchaser of music out there. They just wanted things that were for the everyday person. The people who could stand around the piano and have family sing-alongs. People who were doing their own little recital at their church, singing songs. And when people stop and look and listen, their reaction is, why didn't I know about her? Why didn't I know about these other women from the era? Where were they? Well, they weren't taught in my music history classes all the way through a master's degree. But they're there now, and we're doing the work to bring that back. The Gena Branscombe project came about with my friend Dan Ryan. We got to talking after Pilgrims of Destiny was over, and he mentioned he wanted to continue Gena's legacy, that we needed to do something to continue promoting her and all these other women to make them come to the 21st century and make them alive. He said, let's create a not-for-profit. And he said, Gena believed in education. She believed that women get ahead with education. He said, let's give out scholarships. We gave out scholarships in 2020. We also that year gave out an honorable mention in conducting. Damali Willingham was our scholarship winner in 2020. Damali arranged Gena Branscombe's Festival Prelude, which was written in 1914 and performed at the MacDowell Colony.
My name is Damali Willingham. I am a composer, a conductor, a bassoonist, a teacher, and, doing all the things that musicians need to do to, make a sustainable living. Pandemic time. I was a sophomore at the Berklee College of Music. I was just out there on the internet looking for scholarships and financial resources, and I came across the Gena Branscombe project. Then I started doing some research on Gena Branscombe, and I was like, whoa, this woman is awesome. And like a lot of really awesome composers who were not necessarily the best represented in that space got kind of written out of history. Anytime I see a person like that who has had a career and has done the thing, I automatically feel some sort of connection to them because I have an understanding of what the experience of just, the day-to-day of navigating those spaces looks like. The conversations that you have, the imposter syndrome, the feeling like, am I going to be good enough for this? Constantly questioning yourself. To arrange a piece very loosely means that you take an existing piece of music and you rewrite it for another ensemble, like a different type of ensemble, maybe like the same ensemble, but you change some things in it. The piece was initially scored for orchestra, for full symphonic orchestra, and I arranged it for wind ensemble. So still a large ensemble, but a lot different in that primarily you don't have strings. And it was also a challenge because this piece of music in particular, there was only one score, and it was a handwritten score. There were also no recordings available. So I'm looking through a handwritten score. There are some parts of it, it's like eraser marks, and like there are some notes that are like really, really tiny in the measures. And I'm like, I can't tell if that is a B or an A, just kind of like going through very like nitpicky things like that would make a huge difference in the scope of the music. All in all, it probably took me about 2 months from very beginning of the process. The piece was performed in May of 2022 by the Berkeley Symphonic Winds, and I conducted that performance, and yeah, it was really fun. It was a really fun thing to do. In terms of, just the music that really speaks to me, I love using the orchestra in ways that the orchestra hasn't been used or hasn't been traditionally used. And so the idea of bringing music of other diasporas into the orchestra and kind of melding genres and melding worlds and seeing what new sounds and new textures can be formed out of that is where my passion really, really lies. And so I would love to create an ensemble one day that is centered in that world. And I really want to see jazz music generally of the African diaspora and of world diasporas brought into the orchestra, because as the orchestra exists in America, as we know it, we're still following, for the most part, the Eurocentric model that has been modeled to us since the who knows what century, since orchestras were founded. I think that there is also a very untapped area of what can the orchestra do when we bring in all of these new, I shouldn't even say new, when we bring in all of these genres and all of these other musical worlds that haven't existed in this space. Like what happens when those come together?
This episode of The Ladies Speak was recorded by David Yaz at the Boston Podcast Network and Roger Morgan Pheonix, featuring How Do I Love Thee, Elaine Keeler, piano, and Wanda Precision, vocals. A Memory, courtesy of New Focus Recordings, performed by Lansdowne Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Ruben Blundell. Dear Lad o' Mine, courtesy of Albany Records, Kathleen Shimeta, mezzo-soprano, and Martin Hennessy, piano. Pilgrims of Destiny, performed by Clark University Choirs, and conducted by Dan Ryan. Heavenly Noel, courtesy of Delos Productions. Alluring Columbine and Pierrot's Song, Reagan Russell, piano, and Gabriel Sullivan, violin. Kona Beach, performed and arranged by Katie Halbert. Festival Prelude, arranged by Damali Willingham, and Reclamation, composed by Damali Willingham. Thanks to WNYC Archive Collections, New Focus Recordings, Rob Grove, Jennifer Yadov, and Kathleen Shimeta.